Hello, and welcome to another Center for Progressive Urban Politics podcast. I am your host, Kevin Lynn, and I am joined by the co-founder of CF Pup, Stephen Lamb. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm doing good this afternoon, Kev. Thanks.
Excellent. And I am so excited because on this March 29th, Sunday afternoon, we are joined by John Michael Greer. John is an author of over 40 books. He's a popular blogger, and his long-running blog, Echo Sophia, is just amazing. Strongly recommended to everyone. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on.
Right on. Wow. The reason I'm so excited to have you on, John, is that the world changed, and it changed in the course of just 30 days. With the COVID-19 pandemic, or Wuhan flu pandemic, however you want to call it, whatever you want to call it, it's changed everything. It's changed, it's thrown a monkey wrench into the economy. It's changed how we govern. It's changing relationships among nations and quite possibly among states here in the Republic. So to get things going, John, I thought I'd like to get your view on kind of putting this pandemic, and we can call it a pandemic because that's what WHO is finally calling it. Get your thoughts on putting it in a kind of a historical perspective, on how people deal with pandemics, physically and as well as emotionally, and then kind of look at how we're dealing with this currently.
Okay. To begin with, it's important to keep the historical thing in mind. One of the problems that we have these days with media, and more generally, is that everybody acts as though their historical imagination stops about a week ago. And nobody takes the time to think, okay, what happened the last time? Because there have been similar situations. I'm thinking the Hong Kong flu of 1968, which killed some millions of people worldwide. The Asian flu of 1957 was even worse. They were influenza viruses rather than coronaviruses, but it was roughly the same sort of thing. Highly contagious, spread very rapidly, killed a bunch of people, mostly among the elderly and the already ill. It's a similar situation. Those also caused a pretty fair economic hit, but there was not the same kind of attempt to shut down the entire. We are a lot more risk averse in the present world than people were in 68 or 57. People freak out at the thought of some additional deaths to a greater extent than they do. Understood. It's not pleasant when grandma dies. Okay, but I am not sure that the degree of economic reaction that's gone, the wholesale shutting down of the economy, is that good of an idea. I'm not sure that it will actually help anything. We'll see. I mean, I don't have access to the computer models that they're using. Of course, one set of computer models they were using turned out to be inaccurate and has now been updated and replaced by the same people who did the original set, the folks at Imperial College over in Britain. But basically, people are acting as though this is something unprecedented. Right? That word gets massively overused. It's not. This is a normal process. It's something that happens every couple of generations. And we are extremely fortunate that this is a virus with a relatively low death rate. The death rate from the Spanish flu is estimated to have been between 10 and 20%. Here we're dealing with something that, in the United States at least, seems to be running about a 1% death rate.
So far, yeah, that's right.
And sorry, Steve, go ahead.
1% here so far, and about 3% in Italy. But the question is, I think that what's happened is that the Chinese were not honest about their death numbers, and that we had some sort of intel that the death numbers were much higher, and that the Western powers therefore reacted to what they believed, or probably what was extrapolated to them about what the numbers are. I mean, I
think that's quite possible.
Yeah. Because they wouldn't shut down the economy like this because 3,000 people died in China. That's just
they shut down China, which was amazing. We were joking earlier when I had mentioned that on March 3rd, the last boat had pulled into Long Beach Harbor in California from
Mm-hmm.
China, and no other ships have arrived. I don't.
Mm-hmm.
That's gonna throw our supply chain into. That's just really going to upturn it.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great thing.
Yes, it is. A temporary inconvenience, but it is a useful reminder that resilience is a good thing. That having every country in the world dependent on one set of factories in one country on the far side of the Pacific is not actually that bright.
Right. If you look at the complexity of instruments today, like my iPhone,
Mm-hmm.
if Foxconn can't get one small widget for that, you don't have an iPhone. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's the reality today. That's
Mm-hmm.
how complex things have become, and possibly how fragile things have become.
Well, one of the great advantages here is that many of the things that make up global trade right now aren't actually that useful or much less necessary. Somehow I get along perfectly well without an iPhone, for example, or in fact without a cell phone at all. We have gotten very comfortable, very complacent at the idea of just-in-time ordering. The stuff will always be there. Well, maybe it won't always be there, and so this has a chance. This has the potential to become a wake-up call that will remind people that having some resilience, having some redundancy in place, it may be, quote, inefficient, unquote, in terms of economic models, but it's a really good idea when you actually want to get necessary goods and services in a hurry.
Yeah, I'm here in California, and we had a system that was set up by Governor Schwarzenegger
Mm-hmm.
of 3 emergency football field-sized hospitals, and they had, I think, something like 50 million masks.
Mm-hmm.
And after Schwarzenegger left, Governor Brown just decided that was really inefficient. They didn't need that, and so they stopped paying the $5 million a year carrying cost on that.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
And $5 million in the $19 billion a year California budget is completely insignificant, and we sure could use it now, though.
There's that, yes.
Yeah.
No, and this is just it. So many people got caught up in the romance, in the fantasy of globalization, the sort of Star Trek notion that we actually have these replicators that make things suddenly appear, and do our best not to notice that they're being made by sweatshops and third world hellholes and places and things like that.
And it's easy to think because you order something from, let's say, DJI, and it's shipped from China to your doorstep.
Yeah, it just shows up. It's like the legendary urban kids who are astonished to find out that carrots actually grow in dirt. We've become painfully, in fact, counterproductively and dangerously detached from the industrial as well as the agricultural realities that support our lives. And if this helps people stop and take a deep breath and go, oh, maybe that's really dumb, then very possibly some good may come of this whole business.
Yeah. So, John, Charles Hugh Smith defines neoliberalism as the unfettered movement of capital and people across borders in order to maximize profits. In short, globalization. What do you think? What do you think the impact on globalization is going to be?
Globalization was already in deep trouble. We saw with the election of Donald Trump here in the United States, with the vote for Brexit, and then the re-election of Boris Johnson in the UK, several other similar elections. The backlash against the globalized economy has become a massive political force, and it's one of the things that makes it so massive is precisely the fact that those people who benefit from it refuse to talk about the costs. And so we get all of this shrieking online and elsewhere, whether it's Orange Man bad or whether it's the equivalent in England or what have you, people who are utterly outraged that they can't simply have things go the way they do, but they will not talk about the costs those policies inflicted on the vast majority of working class people in many countries around especially across the formerly industrial world. And so globalization was in deep trouble. We've already seen in the United States the beginning of the movement back towards sensible tariffs. We've seen the effects on that of the unemployment rate here, especially unskilled and semi-skilled labor. And this is icing on the cake, because even those people who are not necessarily clued in on the fact that supply and demand controls the value of labor and the size of your paycheck, can realize that it's actually a really dumb idea to be dependent on factories on the other side of the planet for things that you need right here and now, because there can be disruptions, as we're seeing.
Right. And what's amazing to me, I grew up during the Cold War and participated in it the whole decade of the 80s. I was in the Army, and it was always that term you heard all the time, guns and butter. And then as you talked about, being resilient, having in all the industries, part of our national security was our ability to feed ourselves and manufacture the goods necessary to, not only for our weapon systems, but also to keep the economy humming along.
Exactly. And the thing is that has been a central part of policy in the United States, certainly from the beginning of its national history. The idea that we should not be dependent on any foreign country, on any foreign power for anything essential. That was central to our national policy until the coming of the age of globalization, when, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the assumption in the circles of power seems to have been, oh, well, we don't need to worry about that anymore. We can just go in and engage in a kleptocratic frenzy, and nothing bad can possibly happen. And so we had a period of some decades where the working class was thrown under the bus.
Absolutely. And really, I think the fall of the Berlin Wall was the day the world changed with regard, because prior to that, again, getting back to the Cold War, it was all about how well we treated our workers, because we could all say, well, the American worker is better fed, makes more money, has a better standard of living than the Soviet man.
And we went. Yeah, and we went from that. We went from a time, when I was growing up, when a working class family with one income could afford a home, they could afford a car, they could afford 3 square meals a day, the occasional luxury. They were in decent shape. Now, how well is a working class family with one working class income doing? That's the hugest political fact of our time in America. The planned destruction of the American working class, the descent from where we were to the situation where on one working class income you're on the street. That's the primary political fact of our time. It's the thing that most people in the chattering classes will not mention, will not discuss, and it's the reason Donald Trump's in the White House today.
I'm curious, John. Describe when you say the chattering classes. Because I've heard terms like our quote unquote thinking classes. How would you describe the chattering class?
The chattering classes, it's a term I honestly don't remember where I borrowed it from. It is not original to me. But by the chattering classes, I mean those classes who have an active role in the political and cultural discourse of our time. Those people whose opinions are splashed around the media, whose opinions appear in locations that people turn to when they want to know what they're supposed to think. And I suppose it overlaps to some extent with the intelligentsia, but it includes political figures, opinion makers of all kinds. That's the chattering classes. And it's not entirely talking heads; it's also talking fingers. There's a lot of people who simply express themselves on their keyboards, but yeah, any developed, any complex society sorts itself out into a minority of chattering classes and a majority whose views are not welcome in the collective discourse of their time. And the size of the gap between those two, between the opinions of the chattering classes and the opinions of here's an old-fashioned term for you, silent majority, that gap determines just how explosive the politics of that time are going to be. As long as the chattering classes pay attention to what the silent majority wants and what its concerns are, at least now and again, things can move along fairly smoothly. When you get a situation, as in the recent past, where the chattering classes dismiss the concerns of the majority as irrelevant, doesn't exist, they're deplorables, they're hicks, they don't matter, they should just all curl up and die. We hate them. We hate them, my precious. When that's the voice of the chattering classes, and of course that has been the voice of the chattering classes in the United States for a couple of decades now, then you're looking at an explosion. And we are fortunate that that explosion took place politically. It did not have to. We could have ended up with a domestic insurgency.
So you're saying that the election of Donald Trump is actually a pop-off valve or a safety valve for revolution?
Exactly. That's the thing about democracy. When I think it was Winston Churchill who said that democracy is the worst system of government there is, except for all the others. And he's quite right. It's got. One could spend weeks listing its failures, but it does one thing better than just about anything else. It allows changes of power without mass bloodshed.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of the silent majority having to go into their well-stocked gun safes and go to war, launch a domestic insurgency, plunge the country into 4 or 5 years of civil war, and eventually impose their will, they could simply turn out at the polls and vote in, vote in Donald Trump.
Yeah.
While we're talking about elections and Donald Trump, I want to point out to our listeners and viewers that in January 2016, you were one of the few voices that, and you were dead certain that Donald Trump would be elected president in the general election of 2016, and largely because, whether he believed it or not, he was speaking to class warfare. While we're on, again, this is a great segue, because I wanted to get your take on the coming 2020 elections. First, looking at the Democrat side of the House and Biden, who is now the front runner, and then what do you see for the general?
Okay, the Democrats really have backed themselves into a difficult corner here, because during the early sections of the run for the nomination, most of the Democratic candidates positioned themselves way over to the left. You had all those people putting up their hands, insisting that we need to give free health care to illegal aliens, for example, and just one thing after another, which was very appealing for a minority of extreme leftists, but generally most Americans, even most Democrats, did not support those points of view. And so the one straggling figure who was more or less to the right of the pack, Joe Biden, has ended up as a de facto frontrunner. He's a terrible candidate. He
stumbles all over himself.
Exactly. He has the great some people are really good at thinking and speaking off the cuff. Joe Biden is not one of them. And it would be nice if this kind of thing were, if we decided who our leaders were going to be on the basis of some kind of deep thought and contemplation, but we don't.
And he doesn't anyway.
Well, there's that. I think I've never met the man. I have no idea what's behind the airbrushed facade we all get. The same is true of any politician. He doesn't seem to be a particularly deep thinker. He certainly doesn't handle sudden events well, sudden questions. And he's very old, and I think possibly, frankly, past it. And we'll see. But he's a very, very poor candidate. He's the only one they've got left, because everyone else basically ran to the far left and went much further left than the voters will go. So the question is, what are the Democrats going to do? Because if Joe continues the way he's going, they're doomed.
Right. I mean, do you think something could happen at the convention for the Democrats?
At or before, yes. I think that there is a very real possibility that one way or another, it does not surprise me, for example, that all kinds of old allegations of sexual improprieties are suddenly being brought up
Oh,
about Joe
Tom,
Biden.
I don't think you read the papers this morning.
You know,
Apparently, something was brought up on Friday
uh-huh.
against Uncle Joe.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I've seen some mutterings about that on the internet and so on. But yeah, and they can build up. They can produce some kind of scandal, force him to step down, and then get some other candidate who might have a chance of winning. The chance is not good. On the one hand, Trump has his reelection fund. I forget how large it is, but it's record setting, and mostly small donations.
Right.
So he has a huge battle fund. He's got the ground game. He has millions of people who will doorbell and do all the other stuff that you do to run a grassroots campaign. He's got his approval ratings have risen dramatically among African Americans, among Hispanic Americans, among American women. He's getting increased support from the gay community these days.
Yeah.
A lot of core Democratic constituencies are moving toward him because the Democrats have not defended their constituencies. The Democrats have been too busy running to the extreme left.
I have to give you an example of that. So last year, I attended the year before, 2018, I attended the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference in Eugene, Oregon at the university there. And you couldn't find a more woke spot in America, I don't think. And there was a tech worker who was living in Seattle at the time, and we wanted to come together and strategize for our group, U.S. tech workers. And for those who are not familiar with it, it's a group designed to look at the displacement of U.S. tech workers by these Indian consulting firms and tech companies. So this guy comes down. I'd never met him before. He's a 6'4" Black American, descendant of slavery, wearing a big red MAGA hat. He met us at this event, and it was almost like watching the seas part. But that was an example. The guy is hardcore for Trump. So it is pretty amazing. And again, I think Trump is speaking. Trump, whether he's doing anything effective or not, he's certainly speaking to what is ailing the productive class.
And that's the thing. Basically the Black American community has supported the Democratic Party for decades now, on the basis of the promise that sooner or later the Democrats will actually get around to doing something for them. And they've been waiting, and they've been waiting, and they've been waiting, and then Trump gets into office, and we have significant prison reform, which is something that concerns African Americans a great deal. We have, the African Americans are much more likely to be socially conservative and religious than the average American. So, if once Trump starts giving them things, and now he's talking about really pushing school choice, which is a hot button in the African American communities. They know perfectly well that the extremely poor public schools in most African American neighborhoods are one of the main burdens they face. They want charter schools. They want the ability to send their kids to a better school and not just take whatever the educational bureaucracy wants to offer them. Of course, the educational bureaucracy doesn't want anything to do with that, and the Democratic Party has systematically backed the bureaucrats. So now Trump and his Department of Education are really pushing school choice, charter schools, and things like that. And that's, again, hugely popular in the African American community. So, and of course, we've got the effect of decreasing unemployment for unskilled, semi-skilled labor, entry-level jobs. African American unemployment is the lowest that it's ever been. So this is making a difference, and a lot of people in the African American community are saying, okay, we have all these promises from the Democrats, and we have these actual gains that we're receiving from the current inmate of the White House. And which way are we going to vote? Well, Trump's approval, depending on which poll you look at, has gone from around 8 or 9% of the African American community at the time of the election to somewhere between about 30 and 40%. And that is a tectonic shift. That is a gargantuan shift.
Mm-hmm.
And if only 20% of the African American votes for Trump and votes more or less for the people down ticket from him, Democrats don't have a winning majority anymore.
Right, they'll never hold the White House. Yeah.
Yeah, no, the Democrats at that point are losing, shall we say, bigly.
Which is, interesting enough, a friend of both Steve and I, Beth Carnell, is one of the founders of and really the ideological head of the American Descendants of Slavery movement. And they have thrown everything but the kitchen sink at her. I mean, she absolutely has the establishment frightened. I think.
Oh, of course.
And it's amazing because Yvette is completely independent. She's not pro-Democrat. She's not pro-Republican.
Yeah, that's the thing that scares them most. If African Americans start voting as an independent bloc and they turn to both parties and say, okay, what are you going to give me this time? What are you actually going to give me? Screw the promises. What are you going to give me? Then the parties actually have to listen to the voters.
Yeah.
Because whoever gets the majority of the African American, that's a 10% block. That's huge in American electoral politics. And if they can do it, what about some of the other groups? What about the Hispanic vote? At this point, the tendency, the insistence on the part of now this is a hot button subject, the whole transgender issue. Okay, it's complicated, it's messy. But the Democratic Party, by and large, has gone to the extreme end of one viewpoint, to the point that there are a lot of people in the gay and lesbian community, especially among the lesbians, who feel that the Democratic Party simply abandoned them.
Oh, yes, very much.
And so at what point do we see, actually we're already seeing, the gay and lesbian community, which is well organized politically and very effective, as we saw with the whole same-sex marriage thing, they managed to pursue something that everyone, the standard view was impossible, and they got it. So they've got this hugely well-organized, well-connected voting bloc. They're becoming a free player that might be successfully appealed to by either party. That's when democracy actually starts becoming fun, because then the parties actually have to listen to voters, and of course that's the last thing that either party wants.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Well, interestingly, I wanted to also get your opinion on the economy. On Friday, Donald Trump signed the Coronavirus Aid Relief and what is it called? The Economic Security Act, the
CARES Act. I wish. Can we please pass a law to forbid cute acronyms on laws? That's just.
I was blown away when I saw, oh my God, my gosh.
They probably spent 5 or 6 hours of
so cynical. It's just so cynical.
It's totally cynical. Yeah, the thing is, it's a brilliant political move, which is of course why the Democrats desperately tried to stop it from happening. What they want, no, we want target aid, which means a slush fund like the one that happened under Obama. We can hand that out to our friends. No, everyone's going to get a check for, $1,000. And there are several stages for that. That whole thing has several layers. On the one hand, again, those checks will all have Donald Trump's signature on them.
True.
And contributions, yeah.
Yeah, and that's going to count at the ballot box. Secondly, one of the things that has been stirring around in the whole issue of social welfare programs for a while now is the claim, which works out mathematically, that it would actually be more economical, it would cost less money to send a check to every American than it would be to support the current social welfare system. Because most of the money that goes into the welfare system pays the salaries of bureaucrats.
Well, yeah, the problem is if we do that, we would have to put all the bureaucrats on relief.
And what's the problem with this?
Well, they would form a voting bloc that would be really pissed off because they would be
Yeah.
suddenly underemployed, like all of us blue collar laborers have been for years.
Exactly. But you see, I think one of the things that has the Democrats terrified about this whole project is that it can be seen as a pilot test. What happens when we just give every American $1,200 to help them through difficult times? If it works, at what point do we start seeing a significant movement toward a situation where whole sections of bureaucracy start being eliminated, and instead we just send a check?
Mm-hmm.
And that's also the thing is that's important because, of course, government bureaucrats are a significant voting bloc. They are a power base of the Democratic Party, have been since the New Deal. And if
a power base within the government itself, I mean,
exactly.
I'm kind of a believer in the deep state, and they're certainly a big block of that.
Well, and one of the other things, one of the other really revolutionary things the Trump administration has been doing is moving federal bureaucracies out of D.C. They've got what is it? The Bureau of various. I think the Department of the Interior is moving to like Colorado or something like that, and big sections of the Department of Agriculture are moving to Kansas City. And the bureaucrats are incensed. They don't want to leave the Beltway, but it makes a lot of sense to have the Farm Bureau someplace where there are lots of farmers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, it's beautiful.
Too funny. Yeah, it's when I look at this, I just have to kind of say, like you said, where is it all going?
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on UBI then, given what you just said, John?
I want to see how it works. I want to see, basically, we have a chance with these checks going out to see what happens if we give every American $1,200. And that's something I want to see, some experimental evidence. I want to see some field tests, and we have a chance for one. I don't know that I'm in favor of UBI. I think, among other things, it would see rents jolt up sharply. There's more money. It's the usual.
Money changing goods. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's prices vary depending on availability of product and availability of money. And so, but we'll see. We're going to have to see how it works. Certainly, though, I think that our social welfare systems could be dramatically simplified. That instead of having this mess of partly overlapping programs, get to just a situation where people in need get a check in the mail. We don't have to have these separate food stamps, the separate AFDC, the separate WIC program, the separate this, all of these things which all employ the cadres of bureaucrats. We just have to have some accountants and a check writing machine.
And I think that's going to be extremely important going forward. I have a friend, Linda, and she's an architect, and she designed. When this chef cooking school went out of business in Pasadena, she designed the interiors for what's now a robot factory. And they're actually teaching these robots how to cook every cuisine in the world. And you'll be able to get a robot to replace your chefs for like $50,000, and it'll come with, programs on how to do things. And so the robots, probably within 5 years, are going to replace short order cooks and
I've been here. People have been saying that since I was 5.
How old are you?
And I 57.
Okay.
I mean, I read about that in comic books when I was a small child, and I'm perfectly willing to assume that it may happen someday. But I actually want to see it happening before I'm going to say, well, in 5 years. It's like fusion power. That's been 20 years in the future for how long?
About 70 years.
Exactly. So, yes, I'm sure they will succeed in automating some more things as we go, depending, of course, on the continued availability of rare earth elements and some of the other things in the supply chain that make that possible, and also the issue that supply and demand, as wages demand, the demand for human employees in certain fields drops, wages go down. At what point do you undercut the cost of the robot? I mean, there are jobs in China right now and in India, which are being filled by people rather than machines because it's cheaper to hire a person.
Well, yeah, isn't globalization grand?
It does. I mean, we are seeing that huge deflationary
Mm-hmm.
impact on everything. And this is really what technology has given us is
Mm-hmm.
great deflation. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Wages are not going up. You would think that if people are more efficient and you
Mm-hmm.
hire fewer people, those wages of those people working would go up, but that doesn't seem to have been the case.
No, the thing is, we're going through a very complicated transition right now because we have had in America, especially, an economy focused on um, well-to-do consumers. And so we have an incredibly bloated retail sector, and everything that feeds into that sector has mushroomed, metastasized to gargantuan scale. That's breaking down. Meanwhile, there's a lot more jobs in factories. There's a lot more jobs for, as I mentioned, unskilled and semi-skilled labor. And so you're having this weird transformation. And I think it's partly a geopolitical thing. The United States is no longer the world's dominant power. We don't have a dominant power in the world right now. We're going through that transition. We are very quietly scaling back our presence around the world. In the middle of the whole virus panic, I think it was about a week ago, words leaked out that the U.S. had quietly abandoned 2 more bases in Iraq. And I think there's another one that's currently slated. There's no announcement is being made. You don't make such an announcement when you're backing away from global power. But bit by bit, we're scaling things down. We're withdrawing our forces to what we can actually reasonably control. And in that process, the U.S. has to return to more of a manufacturing economy, less of a tribute economy. Because we are within sight of the period when the dollar will not be the global reserve currency anymore, where we cannot simply run whatever deficit we want to run and expect the rest of the world to pay for it.
Luxury that we've had.
Exactly. So we're scaling down from that. Another way in which the current virus thing has been extremely helpful is that it's helped deflate the current ongoing bubble in the stock market, which had inflated to absurd levels. Okay, now we've cleared a lot of ground very fast, and we can blame it on the virus, so nobody has to point fingers at anything but viruses. And so a lot of fictive wealth, a lot of completely imaginary, hallucinatory claims on wealth has dried up and blown away all over the world. That's great. It's part of a reset that we badly needed.
Well, and hopefully, like where I live in California, our real estate market since the 2008 crash has been completely inflated, mostly by Chinese, but certainly by money. And I'm looking forward to the realization that's going to happen where that's not going to be the case anymore. There's a multiplier of your wages in most places in the United States. It's about 2.5 to 3 years' wages to the price of a house. In California, it's 9.8.
This is why I left the West Coast.
Ah, okay.
I grew up in Seattle.
Oh, okay.
It's not quite as bad there in Seattle, but it's certainly. I'm sitting here comfortably in East Providence, Rhode Island, in a pleasant little working class neighborhood, and the rents are affordable, and it's standard of living is great, and I don't have to deal with the California prices, or if I may be frank, the California mindset.
I understand. I'm a native Californian, and I can't stand the present mindset.
Yeah, exactly. The thing is, I know perfectly well that not all Californians suffer from that weird state of consciousness. It's like I've met people from New York City who are really polite and kind.
I understand that in Rhode Island, the National Guard is setting up checkpoints to try to keep the New Yorkers from.
Oh, it's more than that. They've got National Guard people going door to door in the resort cities around Newport and so on in the south of the state, looking for contraband New Yorkers. Because a whole bunch of people tried to flee New York City for various, vacation spots, bringing the virus with them. And I've had mixed feelings about our state governor here to some extent, but she's doing a great job, Gina Raimondo. She's actually doing a really good job, not freaking out, but doing the things that are necessary to maintain public health, and in a measured way. And of course, anything that keeps New Yorkers out of the state, most Rhode Islanders consider a very, very good thing.
Well, it's interesting. There's a county called Monroe here in Pennsylvania, where the Pocono Mountains are, a number of mountain resorts. And it's seen this big upshoot in coronavirus cases. And it's like,
oh yeah,
wow. It's like, New Yorkers fleeing to their dashas.
Exactly. And yeah, so I think it was probably news of that got the Rhode Island government to take decisive action.
Oh, so, it's interesting. When we started the conversation, you had mentioned a few things, and I began, what triggered in my mind, we were talking about looking at the COVID-19 coronavirus in a historical perspective. I shot back to the Antonine plagues in Rome. But then everything else we've said, I keep thinking, my mind keeps going back to Rome. For instance, when Rome was forced to abandon Britain, the Roman army just left. They had no choice. Talking about the base of Iraq. So we've been through all of this before as a species.
The Dutch at one point were one of the world's predominant empires. And the Dutch, being excruciatingly practical and pragmatic people, someone did an accounting of, well, what do we get from the empire and what does it cost us? And they decided that the empire actually cost them more than they received in. And they spent about 5 years dismantling it and developing trade relationships instead.
The thing is, empires are parasitic in nature. You start you conquer a country, you strip it of wealth, and then what do you have? You have a country that needs constant input. India in 1600 was the richest nation in the world. It was overflowing with wealth. By the time the British got through with it in 1946, it was the poorest nation on earth. And Britain had turned from a dumpy little island, mostly noted for codfish, to a global empire. These two things are not unconnected. Britain, in the same way, they did the same math, starting with Ireland. When they allowed the creation of the Irish Free State, they looked at how much it was costing them to hold on to Ireland and how little they were getting back from it after most of a millennium of plundering, and let it go. And they proceeded to do that all the way through until the British Empire was no more, because it very much cost more than it was worth, and that became impossible to avoid during the Second World War, when they had to have us bail them out again. And so in the same way, I think it's beginning to sink in the circles of power in the United States, as it did in Holland, as it did in the Netherlands, as it did in Britain, as it did in Rome back in the day. There's a point at which you have to say, okay, yeah, glory and the unbroken empire, blah, 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 screw that. We need to pull the troops out and maintain retreat to a more defensible perimeter.
Because it's only the elite few that truly benefit. You had mentioned early on in our podcast today that there was a time when a single wage earner could own a home, raise a family.
And an ordinary middle class income was enough to keep you fairly comfortable. And that's not the case. And the reason it's not the case is the economics of globalism, the neoliberal economic system, including the offshoring of jobs, unlimited illegal immigration producing an underclass with no rights who could be paid starvation wages, and metastatic government regulation that benefits big business against small business, when small business is a far better creator of jobs. So you have those three pillars of the whole structure. Those were the things that caused the destruction of the American working class. And equivalent things have happened in previous empires. Now we have a chance to reset that. And I think it's one that a lot of people are taking.
Are you optimistic about where this could go? Or do you think the Republic, once we scrap empire, do you think the Republic will survive, or will we break into... I remember in the 80s, there was a book I read called The 9 Nations of North America.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a novel a few years ago titled Retrotopia, which was set in a post United States America, where the country had broken into like 9 or 10 pieces after an ugly civil war. I thought that was a real possibility at that point, given the way things were going.
Mm-hmm.
I think we may have dodged that bullet at this point. We'll see. You know, there's always the possibility that human stupidity is the one infinitely renewable resource. And so, but I think it's possible that we've dodged this bullet, and that we're good for another few historical cycles. And I don't know. We'll see what happens. I think it is I don't know that the United States will be able to survive indefinitely. It's a very large nation, and large nations generally do tend to fall apart. But we'll see.
And I think it's part cultural. I lived in Los Angeles for 20 years, and I think there's a point where someone is going to wake up and just say, those folks on the Potomac, they just don't get us.
There's a lot of people in a lot of America who are thinking that. Furthermore, there are a lot of Americans who would love to see Los Angeles as part of another country.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
Well, no, I no, I'm sure you're aware of this.
Oh, no, I'm very aware of this. In fact, what's really strange is the people who really want that are either the blue collar and lower middle class people who were forced out of California economically, or their children. As I go in the country and I meet people, very often someone who's like 30 years old or so, I'll get into conversation with them and say, "Hey, where are you from?" And I'll go, "I'm from this place you've never heard of called Altadena, California." And they'll go, "Oh, my parents were from, San Gabriel or wherever." And they start talking to me about, the California that their parents left and how intolerable that was. And I think, oh my God, it's so much worse now if they only knew.
Oh yeah. Oh, no, my mom grew up in Oakland.
Okay. Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
It's interesting you say that. Several years ago, Jane Fonda, back in New York City, for a visit. She had a layover, and she went to this museum that she used to go to a lot in the 50s and 60s. And it was a place where she could go out to the courtyard. It was have a contemplative moment, a meditative moment. And she was just aghast because of the crowds of people. There was no getting away. There was no getting away from this densely packed city that New York City had become. And all the simple pleasures were just siphoned out. And I was amazed to see that article. I think it came out in 2009. And she did literally talk about how, back then we probably had 4 billion people less on the planet.
Yeah.
Well, we had 40% less in the United States.
Yeah. So gosh, it might actually sink in.
Yeah. And she the way she talked, what the vision that formed in my mind was, she's homesick for a place she never left at the end of it. And I think that's where a lot of people in America and throughout the world now, because of, the industrialization that's gone on. Migrations of people.
Yeah, no, you're right. The Seattle that I grew up in was a very nice town. By the time my wife and I left in 2004, it had become a really pretty miserable place. It had progressed into a state of filthy, crowded mess, and so that's why we bailed. And I don't expect ever to go back. There's a part of me, to a large part of me, Puget Sound is always going to be home, but it's a home that does not exist anymore. The neighborhoods that I knew, the local culture that I knew, the landscape. It's the bluest skies you ever seen are in Seattle. Not anymore. It's photochemical smog. 365 at this point. It looks like a slightly like if you can imagine Los Angeles but wet.
Oh yes.
More mold, fewer palm trees.
Wow. Well, John and Steve, we are coming up on our hour. John, is there anything else that I hadn't addressed, or anything you'd like to add? Points that I might have missed?
Yes, the major thing that I'd like to add is that it's very easy for people to get caught up in the moment by moment frenzy of a historical crisis. Oh my God, running around like chickens with their heads cut off. Sit down, take a break, look up the Hong Kong flu of 1968 or the Asian flu of 1957. Realize that we've been here before, and a year from now, probably considerably less than a year from now, it's going to be over with. It's going to be done. We're going to be going back to some fairly close simulacrum of our pre-pandemic lives. And remembering that is a good way to be a lot less freaky and a lot less easily buffaloed into doing stupid things by the media.
Right. Steve, have I missed anything? Any thoughts?
Well, my big thought is that this is probably the greatest opportunity we've had in our generation to turn the ship around. We can use this opportunity to say, hey, we need to make our drugs in the United States. We need to do things that are strategic in the United States. And this is the opportunity to break the back of globalism, and we should take it.
Well, on that note, gentlemen, thanks so much for joining me. John Michael Greer, Steve and I, we talk about you a lot. We definitely follow the blog. And it's really great having this opportunity to sit down and chat with you about pressing matters such as this. I mean, this was has to be one of the most interesting weeks in American history.
Yeah, true enough.
It's great.
Well, it's been a great pleasure to be on.
Well, wonderful. You take care now. And for our folks listening in and watching us, if you're on YouTube, please, if you liked what you heard, please hit that thumbs up button. Also, subscribe to our channel. That way, when we put out new material, you'll always be alerted. And on that note, have a great day, everyone. Stay safe out there.